At 2:47 in the morning, I was standing in the doorway of my patient's bedroom. I could see her face. I could see her hands. I had 2 fingers on her wrist, and I was counting. Pulse, 58. Respirations, 12. She was asleep. And something in the room at the end of the corridor was making sounds that a sleeping woman cannot make. I have been a registered nurse for 11 years. In that time, I have learned to trust what I can measure: pulse, pressure, respiration. The numbers that tell you what is happening inside a body with more honesty than the person inside it is sometimes willing to offer. What I could not measure, what I had no instrument for, was what was in that room. I want to tell you this carefully. Because I spent 6 weeks in that house constructing explanations for what I was hearing, and every explanation I built was good enough to satisfy me for exactly as long as I needed it to, right up until the night I opened the door. This is the story of Room 4, an explanation that almost got me killed, and why my patient said, when I finally left, not, "I'm sorry you saw it." "I'm sorry it saw you." The agency called it a residential placement, 1 patient, their home, full-time medical supervision. I had done 4 of them before this one. A man recovering from hip surgery in Edinburgh, a teenager post-operation in Leeds. They are quieter than hospital work. You learn 1 person instead of a ward. You settle into rhythms. I was told this placement was 6 weeks. A woman in her mid-70s, I'll call her Mrs. Alderton, recovering from a cardiac event at her home in the countryside. Large house. Live-in housekeeper during the day. Good money. My agency described it as straightforward. Straightforward means no clinical complexity they can see from the outside. It doesn't mean no complexity. I arrived on a Sunday in October. Stone farmhouse, set back from a single-track road. The kind of rural landscape that looks beautiful in photographs and feels extremely isolated once the car that dropped you off has gone. Mrs. Frayne, the housekeeper, met me at the door, late 60s, efficient. She showed me the medication storage, the emergency contacts, the patient schedule. Morning meds at 7, observations at 7, noon, 5, and 10. Then she showed me my room, 2nd floor overlooking the back garden. Then she showed me the rest of the house. At the end of the 1st floor corridor, there was a door with a small brass numeral 4 screwed to the wood at eye height. The house had 6 rooms of any size. None of the others were numbered. No room 1, no room 2, no room 3. Just this door at the end of the corridor with a 4 on it. I asked Mrs. Frayne about it. She said the room had always been called Room 4. She said it in the way people say things that are simply facts. No history, no invitation to continue. I noted it. I moved on. Mrs. Alderton was in a high-back chair near the window when I first met her. Small, fine-boned. And she looked at me when I entered with an expression I couldn't immediately classify. Not warmth, not hostility. Assessment. She said, "You'll be the nurse then." Not a question, a categorization. I introduced myself, told her my name, told her what my role would be. She looked at me for a moment longer than the exchange required. Then she turned back to the window and said, "Room 4 is at the end of the corridor." I said I'd already seen it. She said, still looking at the window, "Then you know where not to go at night." I put that in the category of eccentricity. Elderly patients in residential settings sometimes have rules about their space. I cataloged it as a preference and moved on. That was my first mistake. The first week. The first week was unremarkable. You establish the routine. You learn the patient's rhythms. Mrs. Alderton was clear. Quiet in the mornings, more tolerant of conversation in the late afternoon, no television. She read thick hardbacks and looked out the window and made observations about the garden in the tone of someone narrating a slow decline. Clinically, she was stable. Nothing in her presentation troubled me. The house was different. Old stone houses transmit sound differently than modern buildings. They amplify from unexpected directions. Deadening in others, wind through old frames produces sounds that occupy a register between mechanical and vocal. I was learning that vocabulary, learning the baseline, so that deviation from it would be legible. On Wednesday of the first week, at approximately 2 in the morning, then I heard something from the direction of room 4. I was awake, I sleep lightly on placements, and the sound was distinct enough to register as unusual. I sat up, I listened. It lasted approximately 30 seconds and stopped. Rhythmic, not mechanical, not a pipe, not a structural shift. Something with more deliberateness to it, a pattern, slow and consistent, like someone in that room was doing something with a regular tempo. I checked Mrs. Alderton. She was asleep. I stepped into the corridor. The sound stopped. Not faded, not wound down. Stopped, the way a person stops moving when they hear a door open. I stood there for a moment. Silence. I told myself. Building noise. Pipe pressure equalizing. I started walking toward the door. Halfway down the corridor, then it started again. Slower than before. Same rhythm, same character, but the tempo had dropped, deliberate, unhurried, the pace of something that was no longer unaware of being heard. I stood outside room 4, silence again. I considered opening the door. I didn't. Thursday, the doctor visited. Dr. Calver, mid-50s, unhurried, a rural GP who had been seeing the same families for decades. He reviewed Mrs. Alderton's notes, conducted his assessment, was satisfied. We spoke briefly in the kitchen afterward. I mentioned casually that I'd heard something from room 4 in the night, framed it as a building sound query. Old house, unfamiliar acoustics. He poured his tea. He said, "What kind of sound?" I described it, rhythmic, slow, deliberate. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Old houses make all sorts of sounds, nothing to worry about." He said it looking at his tea rather than at me. I heard the sound again on Friday night. Same time, same duration, same character. This time I went to the door. I put my hand on the handle. I stood there for several seconds. I did not open it. I'm a nurse. I'm professionally obligated to enter a room if there's any possibility of a patient in distress. I have acted on that hundreds of times without hesitation. I stood at that door with my hand on the handle, and something in the quality of that slow, deliberate rhythm communicated that what was in the room did not want the door opened. That information arrived before my professional reasoning could argue with it, and I listened to it. And then I felt embarrassed for listening to it, and I went back to bed. Saturday morning, Mrs. Alderton asked how I was sleeping. I told her about the sounds. She looked at her tea. Then she said, "Old houses?" The same phrase, the same gesture, doctor and patient, word for word, as if they had agreed in advance on the answer. That's when I started paying a different kind of attention. Weeks 2 and 3. Mrs. Frayne left every day at 5 in the afternoon. I started watching how she left. She arrived in the mornings with the brisk efficiency of someone beginning a managed task. She left in the evenings with relief. Not performed relief, the specific controlled relief of someone who has been waiting for a moment and is now in it. The loosening around the eyes, The fractional adjustment in the shoulders. She was glad to be going. I confirmed this over 3 days before I was certain I wasn't projecting it. I also watched her cleaning routine. She moved through the house methodically. My room, the spare room, the study, the sitting room, the kitchen. She passed the door at the end of the corridor 3 times each day without stopping, without glancing at it, with the practiced non-attention of someone who has decided, some time ago, that the door at the end of the corridor is not part of her job. I asked her if room 4 didn't need cleaning. She said Mrs. Alderton preferred it undisturbed. I asked who cleaned it then. She said, no one, and closed the subject. 3 people, patient, physician, and housekeeper, with 3 different roles in this household, independently communicating that room 4 was not to be discussed, not to be entered, not to be questioned. Different registers of dismissal, same result. Each response calibrated to end the inquiry without appearing to end it. My satisfying explanation from week 1 began to feel insufficient. I went looking, not into room 4, not yet. I went looking in the ways available without opening a door. Planning records, county archives, a local history database with digitized newspapers going back decades. The house was old, several hundred years in its original structure, multiple owners, passed to Mrs. Alderton by inheritance. Nothing in any of it explained room 4. Then I found it. 1987. A planning notice. An application to demolish the property. Yes, citing structural unsoundness. The application was denied. The lead name on the denial was W. Alderton. A member of Mrs. Alderton's family had blocked the demolition of this house in 1987, 30-odd years before this placement. The house had not been demolished. The house contained room 4. I could not make that into a story that resolved neatly. Every version required me to ignore at least one thing I'd observed: the sounds, the coordinated silence, the housekeeper's engineered distance from that corridor, Mrs. Alderton telling me on my very first day where not to go at night, as if she were warning me, but in the register of someone who already knew the warning wouldn't be enough. I stopped trying to make it resolve. That was the first good decision I made in this house. The sounds that week were different, not louder, faster. The same deliberate rhythm, but the tempo had increased, like something moving from resting toward waking. I stood at the door again that night. I put my ear against the wood. The sound was coming through the door the way water comes through a crack, pressured, directed, finding the available gap. And underneath the rhythm, something else. Not a second sound exactly. More like the absence of sound shaped into something. A quality to the silence between the beats that felt occupied, full. I stepped back from the door. Mrs. Alderton was behind me. She had walked the full length of the corridor without my hearing her. Remarkable in a house where the floorboards announced everything. She was in her nightdress, looking at me with an expression I had not seen from her before. Not the assessment she'd offered on my first day. Something older. She said, "Come away." The voice of someone who has said this before, who has said it perhaps to more than one person standing in this exact spot. I came away. What I thought I understood. Mrs. Alderton made tea, 2 a.m, kitchen, with the focused efficiency of someone using a task to structure a difficult conversation. I said, "What's in room 4? She said, "Nothing that concerns your clinical role." I said, "I've heard something from that room every second night for 2.5 weeks. You and your doctor gave me the same deflecting answer, word for word. Your housekeeper won't go near that corridor. That someone in your family blocked the demolition of this house in 1987. I want to know what's in that room." She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "My husband is in room 4. I waited. She said, "He died in that room 14 years ago. He was there for the last 8 months of his life. He did not want to leave, and I did not make him leave, and he died there, and he has not left since." I said carefully, "When you say he hasn't left?" She said, "I say it plainly because it is plain. I am a practical woman. He is in that room. The sounds you hear are him. I am accustomed to it." She said it the way she described the garden's decline, a long-standing condition, organized around, not engaged with. And here is what I did with that. I believe the truth underneath the story, not the ghost. I'm a nurse. I'm not credulous about the supernatural, but the psychological reality. An elderly woman, alone in this house, profoundly affected by her husband's death in that specific room, had constructed an ongoing relationship with his absence that was expressed through those sounds. A grief she had never processed, made audible. That was why the doctor deflected. That was why the housekeeper stayed away. They were managing around a woman's unresolved mourning. Nobody had the courage to address it directly. I had my explanation. Coherent, human, compassionate. I chose it because it let me sleep. That sentence is the spine of this entire story. I found an explanation that let me sleep, and I stopped looking. I watched Mrs. Alderton differently that week. The way she paused outside room 4 sometimes and raised her hand toward the door and moved on. Once, through a half-open door, I caught her speaking quietly to the empty room. My explanation confirmed grief, preserved relationship with the deceased. The sounds that week were faster still. I put that in the same column. She was sleeping less well. Heightened anxiety, consistent with my explanation. I did not ask the right question. The right question was, if she is generating the sounds, why do they happen when she's demonstrably asleep, and I'm standing outside her door watching the rise and fall of her chest? I had the answer available. I didn't ask the question, because I didn't want to dismantle the explanation that was letting me sleep. The night I opened the door. Week 5. Mrs. Alderton had a bad night on the Tuesday. Blood pressure elevated sharply around 10 in the evening, requiring observations every 30 minutes until 2 in the morning when she stabilized. I was hollowed out by then, alert but empty. The sounds from room 4 started at 2:15, and they were not the same. The rhythm was still there, but slower, much slower. Not urgencies, the intention. The pace of something that has decided something. And then a quality I hadn't heard before, underneath the rhythm. I can only describe it as directional, as if the sound knew where I was, as if it was being produced toward me specifically. I stood outside room 4 with my clinical notes in my hand like a prop. I know how that sounds. And then I held them anyway. Mrs. Alderton was asleep. Mrs. Frayne had left 6 hours ago. I was alone in this house with a room at the end of the corridor that had been producing sounds for 5 weeks, and which I had explained to myself in a way that I now knew, standing here with the sound coming through the door toward me, was not adequate. I opened the door. The room was furnished. A large bed, made up but not recently slept in, a wardrobe, a dresser with a mirror, a chair by the window, an ordinary room, cold, not the cold of a disused space in autumn, the cold of a room where something has taken the available warmth and used it for something else. The sound stopped the moment I opened the door, not faded, stopped. present and then absent with no transition. The silence after was not empty. It was held. I stood in the doorway with 1 foot across the threshold and 1 foot in the corridor. I understand now that was the only reason I was able to leave. The mirror on the dresser was facing the door. What I saw in the mirror, my own reflection, and behind my reflection, the room. And in the room, in the far corner near the window, a depth that the room did not have the physical dimensions to contain. Not a figure, not a shape, a depth. As if the corner of that room extended back further than the wall behind it should have permitted. Much further, the kind of distance that has no business being inside a building. My right hand, the one holding the clinical notes, had gone cold to the wrist. Not the ambient cold of the room, specific, targeted. The cold you feel when something has been close to you without your knowledge and the evidence of proximity is arriving after the fact. I was aware. I cannot explain how I was aware, only that I was, that whatever occupied that depth had been aware of me before I was aware of it, that my schedule, my routes through the house, my sleeping hours, these were known, that the 5 weeks of sounds had not been haunting in any sense I had a framework for. They had been attention. I had been learned. The depth in the corner shifted, not toward me, not a lunge, not dramatic, a reorientation, the specific movement of something that has been at rest for a long time and has decided to stop being at rest. I stepped back. I pulled the door closed. I did not run. Running felt like a declaration, and like announcing myself as something pursuable. I walked to Mrs. Alderton's room and sat in the chair by her bed, and I did not move until Mrs. Frayne arrived at 8 in the morning. Mrs. Alderton woke at 7. She looked at me in the chair. She looked at my face. She said, "You went in." I said, "Yes." She said, "I told you not to." I said, "You were right." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "It knows you now." I had no framework for that sentence. I had no framework for the depth in the mirror, no category, no column. 11 years of clinical training and none of it applied. My frameworks had run out. The last 4 days. I should have left immediately. I had the right to terminate the placement. I didn't leave because Mrs. Alderton was an elderly woman with a serious cardiac history, and I didn't trust that adequate cover would arrive quickly enough. I stayed 4 more days. That decision was mine. What I experienced in those 4 days was not escalation in the way horror stories escalate. No confrontation, no violence. Something quieter and, I think, more accurate to what that thing actually was. It was present in ways it hadn't been before. The sense of being observed, which I had occasionally felt in week 1 and explained away, was now constant, not threatening in the way a person is threatening, in the way that something with no need to hide no longer hides. Objects in positions I didn't recognize from the day before, doors I had left open that were closed. The corridor outside room 4 colder every time I passed it. Not dramatically, incrementally, a fraction each time. Enough that I started measuring the temperature outside that door with my clinical thermometer every time I passed. The readings don't make sense in any documentation of building physics I've been able to find. Mrs. Alderton spoke to me differently, not medically. Underneath the clinical exchange, something that I recognized eventually as apology. She had known what the house contained for 14 years. She had told herself the arrangement held, that it was contained, that the people who came and went were not part of it. She had been wrong about that, and she knew it the morning I came back from room 4 and sat in her chair. On the fourth day, I arranged the handover. I called the agency. I gave a reason that was technically accurate, concerns about the patient's psychological state beyond my contracted role. I briefed my replacement on Mrs. Alderton's medical status. I did not brief her on room 4. I have thought about that decision many times since. I have not reached a verdict. I left on a Sunday morning. Mrs. Frayne stood at the door. Mrs. Alderton had said goodbye the evening before. She had held my hand. She had not touched me once in 5 weeks beyond clinical contact. She held my hand and said, "I'm sorry it saw you." Not, "I'm sorry you saw it. I'm sorry it saw you." I still work. 2 residential placements since this one. Both unremarkable. I was grateful for that in a way I wasn't capable of before this house. That's what I notice now that I didn't before. Old rooms. The kind of cold that isn't structural. The way some people look at certain doors in their houses. Not with fear exactly, but with the specific attention of someone who has made a long-standing agreement with what's behind them. I notice it more than I used to. The first observation I take now, walking into a new house, it isn't blood pressure. It's the doors.